Thank you for attending. This is the SPE technical talk on how to interpret a bond log, hosted by Kirk Harris. Kirk Harris is a technical advisor for ThoroughBond LLC, which provides technical support for cementing and bond log interpretation. He is based in Lafayette, Louisiana, and his current projects extend across the globe from New Zealand to the Guyana Basin. Kirk was the global cementing advisor for Occidental Petroleum, Talisman Energy, and Repsol. He has a total of 39 years of cementing experience, many of those spent with Halliburton, where he worked as a cementer, operations and research engineer, and technology manager. During his career, he has been Halliburton's regional cementing advisor for Asia Pacific, the North Sea, Europe, Africa, the Permian Basin, and the Gulf of Mexico. Kirk graduated from Purdue University with a degree in civil engineering. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending this joint tech talk between SP Georgetown, Guyana, and SP Trinidad and Tobago. I'd like to remind you to put your microphones on mute. If there are any questions, Kirk has said that he is open to taking them. But if there's any that you'd like to leave to the end of his presentation, you're welcome to put those questions in the chat. Beyond that, I'd like to introduce you and invite Kirk once again to introduce himself and start the presentation. So Kirk.
Thank you very much, Christian, for the introduction. I'm very, very happy to be presenting for the next hour or so to both sections, Trinidad and Tobago and the Georgetown, Guyana section. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Here's the agenda for today. It's going to be a test. I'm going to give you a test. So at the end of this presentation, I want to see how many of these you can answer. So here's the agenda in the form of a question. We're going to talk about bond logs. We're going to talk about the basics. We'll talk about some advanced items. But the first question, to be an expert bond log interpreter, you must blank. The second thing we will talk about is knowing the basic CBL curves, the basic CBL log. The first time I saw a log, I had worked in the oil field for about 4 years, had never seen a bond log. I was a cementing guy and I had never seen a cement bond log. What is that? But I'm on location. I had no idea what all of the curves and straight lines meant. The good thing is that it is simple, easy to know. So we'll look at the basic curve. We'll talk about the ultrasonic log, but we'll be focusing on the CBL. And we want to know the three terms: amplitude, attenuation, and resonance. Steel plus cement. Steel, the metal, plus cement equals something. I want you to remember that. I want you to remember what the number one bond log interpretation skill is. And then as a young professional or as an old professional, you need to be this and this. Now I say young professional because if I say old professional, be this and this, the old professional, I know I'm one of them, won't listen to me. He'll say, I don't need you to tell me what to be at this point in my career. The first part, to be an interpreter, I want to think about you, what your role is in bond log interpretation. It touches every position, sooner or later, every position in upstream oil and gas. You're going to run into a bond log, whether you want to or not. We're then going to talk about the basics. We have to talk about cementing. I was speaking with a long-time professional in Europe just a few weeks ago, and he said, "Are you telling me to be a bond log interpreter, you have to know something about cementing?" I thought we were talking sound waves, but we're going to talk a bit about cementing. Of course, we will talk about how to interpret, CBL interpretation, and then we'll get back to you again. As a professional, how do I approach bond logs? What do I need to do to be successful? I want to ask you questions. You can write these if you have a chat feature. I cannot see the chat, but you can write these down so others can see. You can yell it out if you have a microphone. But before I talk about you and how you relate to the bond log, let me just explain a little bit more about me. I'm currently working for CGX Energy in the Guyana Basin. We're drilling a deep water well in the Guyana Basin. And so I get to think about Guyana every day, and just finished a cement job yesterday. I also consult around the world in logging technology, bond log interpretation. I also have horses. I took a little time off and I was a professional horse trainer. And so I want to see how good you are at the horses. I'm going to show you a couple thoroughbreds and you tell me which horse is the fastest. Because to be successful in racing, you can be a good trainer, or you can just get a really fast horse, and that's pretty good too. So here's a picture of Willow. Take a look at him. And now take a look at Blazing Bandit. I want you to tell me which of these two horses, which is the fastest. One of these horses made about $1 million by winning the biggest races in the country. We'll take a look at them together. There's Blazing Bandit and Willow, both enjoying retirement. Which of these two is the fastest? Can you tell? The way that you tell which of these horses is the fastest is you really have to know your business. You really have to know what to look for. And if you look at the way the muscles are attached, if you look at the neck, if you look at the way the horse is balanced and put together, if you look at horses for many years, you would never pick Blazing Bandit. Blazing Bandit was so slow, he never even got to race one time. And Willow, his full name is Willow O'Wisp, set track records, flew to Hong Kong to race in a $6 million race. He was one of the fastest horses that could run. And he's a balanced horse, and you can tell that he's a good horse. The same is true with bond logs. You have to look at them a lot to be an expert. You have to practice. They have to become a part of your projects, a part of what you do. But you can learn enough and learn about the basics that will lead to the next step and the next step to be able to rely on your experts, to be able to understand better. And for your project, your field, you can become the expert in bond logs, especially in your field. If you see log after log after log, you're going to see the same things. You're going to understand them better, and you can become the expert. So we're going to start with the basics. I'll throw in some advanced. I'll tell you how I interpret logs, and we'll look at that process. Here are the basics in very simple terms. And I want to say, first of all, I am a cementing person. I'm not a logging person. And yet I'm talking about logs. But these logs measure the success of my cement job. So years ago, I determined I would learn these logs because every time we had a bad log, my cement job was blamed. And rightfully so many times. The principle is pretty simple. I'm going to ring a bell. I'm actually hitting a crystal glass with a spoon, but you can hear the bell. That is what casing sounds like when it's not wrapped in cement. It's a big, loud sound. I'm now putting my hands around the crystal, and that is my cement. I'm cementing the glass, and it sounds like this. A low, dull thud. When I have no cement, it rings. When I have cement, it doesn't ring. That's how simple the log works. You can imagine, I've never been down hole too far, but I can just imagine it's pretty dark down there and it's pretty quiet. And so we have a tool, as we'll see, that goes down. The CBL makes an audible sound. So it makes a sound, sends the sound out in that quiet place, and it receives the sound back. It's like this bell ringing. And imagine the red line is soundproof. The ear or the receiver cannot hear the bell or the transmitter until the sound goes out and comes back. So we send the sound out. The bond log tool, it sounds like this when it's activated. It makes a click. That's a piezoelectric transducer, a crystal that when electricity is applied from the wireline truck, it contracts and makes a sound. And the sound wave goes out. It goes out at a frequency of about 20 kilohertz, which is actually a very high frequency, but you can hear it. And it goes out. Maybe it goes out and never comes back. I don't know, but usually we hear something. Not always, but usually here comes the sound wave and we pick it up at the receiver. It goes out, reflects, travels down various paths, and comes back to the receiver. That sound wave, the things we want to remember is that we look at amplitude. Amplitude is the height or the loudness of a sound wave peak. And we usually look at the first peak. It's beneficial to look at all of the peaks, but we usually measure the first peak in millivolts. It's electrical energy. When that sound wave comes back, it hits the transducer, also a piezoelectric transducer, and that compression creates electricity and sends it back to the truck up the wire line. We also have attenuation, which is the damping or the quieting of a sound wave as the sound gets not as loud. It's probably better shown like this. The sound wave goes out, and when it comes back, it's not as loud. The amplitude is lower. We can actually calculate attenuation of the distance and the differences between the amplitudes where they're measured. Attenuation is kind of the opposite of amplitude. It's how much an amplitude is lessened or quieted. So a loud or a large attenuation is small amplitude. The other thing we want to look at is resonance. Resonance is the lengthening of a sound wave, either reflection or echo or vibration or reverberation. It's when you keep hearing it. When I ring the bell, I hear a loud ring, but then I hear the trailing vibration of sound. That's resonance. We will not talk about the ultrasonic tool too much. We could spend days on all of the tools and on bond log interpretation. But the ultrasonic tool uses resonance very effectively to determine if we have a good cement job or not. So we have ring. You'll hear me talk about ring. If you go out to a rig site and you tap on the casing while it's sitting on the casing rack, you'll hear a ring. I mean, it's metal. You'll hit it and you'll hear a bit of a ring. Not like this glass I have here or a bell, but you'll hear a ring. And then we have the resonance. We have amplitude, the height of the wave, and we have attenuation, the damping of the wave. So here's our bond log tool. We're going to run it down into this quiet wellbore. And as we run it into the wellbore, in this case, I'm just showing casing, no formation, no cement. And we have a transmitter, the basic tool. 3 feet away, we have the receiver. From that receiver, we're going to measure the amplitude. From the 5-foot receiver, we're going to measure the entire waveform. Now, if we put it just in the open hole formation, F for formation, or on the left, we put it into a cased hole formation that we have filled with cement, and we have our steel casing. We send a sound wave out, and let's pretend we're just in the formation at this point. I'm showing kind of 2 scenarios here. You'll never have both of these scenarios, one side of the formation not cemented and the other side cemented. But I just want to show you how the waves can get a little complicated. Every time we send a wave out, when it hits a boundary, we get a reflection. And then it will reflect and travel down and then to the receiver. And then it will go to the 5-foot receiver, traveling right down the formation. We do have some sound that's reflected traveling down the fluid, but that's coming in very slowly. So we have one path right through the formation to the receiver, and we're listening for that sound. When we do, and we run the log, this is a picture of the sound wave. This is running the log up and down the well by depth, and this is the time function. It's like looking down on the waves of an ocean beach, where the waves are coming in along the beach. The first wave that arrives is right here at the beginning. And then as time goes, these are the waves that come in and we record them. You see all of the squiggly lines. That's because we are reflecting off of formations that have different speeds. Different sound travels through these rocks as the formation varies, slower or faster as we go up and down. If we cement a well, we want to connect the casing by cement to the formation. So when we see crooked waves, that's good. That means we're connected to the formation, and that's a good sign. But this is very straightforward. You send a sound wave out, it comes back, we see the formations. It gets different when we put steel in cement. And now we will circulate cement down the casing. Again, in Guyana, we did it yesterday. Very successful job. Pump down the casing, up the annular space between the casing and the formation. We fill it with cement. And we have a cemented wellbore, which is made up of formation, cement, and casing, and the bonds in between those, and the logging fluid that will run the logging tool inside of. So now it gets a little more complicated. We send the sound wave out, and we get a reflection off of the steel. It goes by Snell's law. When a sound wave or a light wave hits a boundary, the more alike those boundaries are, the more the wave will travel through. So 2 solids together, cement and steel, the sound wave travels through the steel into the cement. If there is no cement there and it's steel and water, a big difference in properties, then a lot of sound is reflected. And it's reflected down the casing. So what we receive is a very loud signal. It gets worse than that for a cemented well. And this is what makes bond log interpretation so tricky. We send the sound wave out, we get reflections off of the steel, reflections off of the cement, reflections off of the formation. They all come down, they join together in a composite wave at the 3-foot and the 5-foot receiver. And now we get not just the formation signals, we get reflections and refractions and signals down the steel. And this is the log we get. We now get straight lines. Crooked lines were good. We were attached to the formation. Straight lines are bad. That means the energy did not go out. The energy is traveling down the steel. And if the energy is traveling down the steel, that means there wasn't a good solid outside that casing to send the sound wave out. Straight lines are bad. Crooked lines are good. Straight lines will distort crooked lines. They will cover, they will hide, and it makes it very difficult to see. This is my formula of casing plus steel. Casing plus steel equals reflections and vibrations. Reflections and vibrations equal confusion, especially a lot of straight line reflections. Confusion usually leads to misinterpretation. So the answer to the question is cement plus steel leads to misinterpretation. It is estimated that we misinterpret 50 to 80% of all of our bond logs. And I'm going to tell you, as we look at interpreting, I don't think we hardly ever interpret the bond log correctly when we have a marginal or a confusing log. It's very difficult now, and I'll explain why in just a bit. I was looking on LinkedIn today because I made a couple comments. A couple bond logs show up on LinkedIn, and everybody comments. And I made some comments that I may be right or wrong in my comments, but I look at all the comments and there are a lot of opinions on how to read a bond log. And not everybody can be right because a lot of the opinions were very different. And so we're going to see a lot of misinterpretation if we don't method, if we don't have experience, if we don't have understanding. I'm not going to show you much of this. I'm showing you this. This is a lightweight cement or a low density cement. Bond logs were made for normal cements. They were not made for some of the cements that we now pump. And so we see straight lines. That's bad. We see some crooked lines. That's good. We see some early attenuation, some late attenuation. That's good. It is hard to interpret lead cements sometimes. And I just put this up here to show that it's not always just a snap of the fingers and easy. There's a process that we go through and things we look for and things we consider when identifying low density cements. If we're doing a full training, we would go through 2 hours of how to interpret low density cements. But let's look at the basics. This is the bond log. It has 5 curves. That's it. The first bond log I looked at, I thought it had 400 curves. That's what it looked like to me. This is very simple. You have to keep interpreting, but the log itself is simple. We send out a sound wave and we listen for it. The dark line is the gamma. It's just measuring the natural radiation of the wellbore. So it's giving us some formation changes, shales versus sands or limestones, for example. That dotted line right next to it, do you know what that dotted line is? And we have many logs. I probably look at, this month I probably looked at 10, 15 different types of logs. So we get all sorts of different displays and logs, but this is the basic. This is the transit time. It should be straight. It's measuring the first wave that we hear at the 3-foot receiver. How long did it take to get there? And if it's traveling down the steel, steel is homogeneous. It's the same steel. It should always arrive at the same time if our tool is centralized and our fluid inside is the same, our steel is the same, our casing, that should be straight. We use that as a quality control. We have our casing collar locator, which is basically a magnet picking up the massive steel at the collars, tells us joint to joint. Then we have the amplitude. In a slide or two, I'm going to tell you we do not use the amplitude to interpret. We can refer to it. It will help us, but we cannot just look at the amplitude and say good or bad. We have to do a little more work than that. We have a saying at ThoroughBond, and that is, if you look at the amplitude for more than 5 seconds, you have to slap yourself. And you have to slap yourself hard enough that you'll remember slapping yourself, but you have to slap yourself hard enough to look at the VDL. Now, the amplitude is the height of the wave of the first arrival. That would be a first arrival over here, but it's the first arrival that occurred at this point, and we measured in millivolts, usually 0 to 100. This is very low. And so we have an amplified amplitude, which is 0 to 10. Same curves, just different scale. The VDL, if we were to pick up this amplitude, would be the arrival that comes in first, right here. But our amplitude on this log is so low, you don't even see it. It's a straight line that you can't even see. And then we have the VDL. That is the formation. The VDL is made up of arrivals coming down the casing. That's those straight lines. First thing we hear, sound traveling down the casing. That's the casing ring. We have the formation arrivals. The formation arrivals are those crooked lines as we go from fast to slow formation here. At the end, we can pick up the fluid arrivals. Fluid arrivals are traveling on the inside of the casing next to the logging tool. It's going through a slow fluid since sound travels through fluids slower than the solids. But sometimes they'll show up and confuse us or distort the picture. Do not use amplitude to interpret the CBL. I can say this now. I'll say this one just to be a little controversial. I don't mean to sound mean here, but there are 2 people who do not interpret logs very well. I could say 3 people, but for your oil company, you have someone who is probably the cement bond log interpreter. And I don't know their background, but cementers usually don't interpret the CBL. I wish they did. And when they do, I know some, I think they're very good at it. But often we don't get involved. We leave that to logging. There are some logging engineers who can interpret. They're practical logging engineers. They understand that there are limitations to their tool and they know how to interpret. For most oil companies, it's the geologist or the petrophysicist that does the interpretation. And of course, you can have good interpreters there too. But for the most part, logging, boy, this is really going to make me popular among the logging industry. For the most part, petrophysicists and logging engineers do not interpret very well. That's my opinion. I can't hear you because your mic is off, but there are a few people who are booing me right now, but that's okay. Spent much of my time traveling around the world for years, teaching with logging personnel, and they know logging tools, but you really do have to combine the three. We need the cementing engineer, the logging engineer, and the petrophysicist. None alone are very good at this. That's kind of a bad thing to say. There are some who are excellent. So if you're a petrophysicist, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the other petrophysicists. You put a petrophysicist, a logging engineer, and a cementing engineer who all understand the logs together, and you've got a team who can interpret the CBL. Right now, it seems like we have one or two people that do it, and we have a lot of opinions, and it gets a little crazy. We interpret with the VDL. Here's why. These logs, this log, these are the exact same logs. The VDL is exactly the same. The client needed 10 millivolts to get a pass, so they turned the dial and he got 10 millivolts. We can manipulate the amplitude very easily. Much more difficult to manipulate the VDL. That's one reason we do not use amplitude. Sometimes the amplitude is not reliable. Sometimes, even when we have an accurate amplitude, it's wrong. It's wrong in the sense of in Qatar, in Texas, the North Sea, all over the world, we have cement jobs that may have almost free pipe amplitude. This is free pipe amplitude. This is free pipe amplitude. These are not free pipe amplitudes, but they're high. When we perforated each of these, there is no circulation at all. We have isolation in all of these cases. A couple, 1, 2 of these are lead cements. This is a weak silica flour cement. This one, and this one are all microannulus. Amplitude, if you live by amplitude, you will die by amplitude. Here are our 3 main things that we see when we run a bond log. Again, we have the gamma, transit time, casing collar locator, amplitude, and VDL. I know there's probably a delay, so my cursor is probably just arriving at the VDL. I apologize. But when we look at the VDL and even the amplitude is uniform. The amplitude, in this case, 13 5/8 inch, is free pipe amplitude. On the VDL, big straight lines. The collars start at 5 feet apart, the distance between transmitter and 5-foot receiver, and span out, big ringing collars. Clearly no cement here. We have good cement, no straight lines. A picture of an open hole log. We're so tightly bonded in such a good cement job. And then we have what confuses us. We have straight lines, we have ringing collars, but we have formation signals. And when we perforate, we cannot communicate at all. We have cement here. Is it a channel? Is it poor bond? That's what we have to understand. The only thing I will say about the bond log is that it is hard to see channels. If this is a channel, it's hard to see or tell that it is. For that purpose, we use the ultrasonic tool. Here you see a well. This is a well that I was involved in. We are bubbling gas to surface through a channel. It's a channel that we would never see with a bond log. So we run the ultrasonic log. To me, the best tool for bond log interpreting, for bond log to determine isolation, is the ultrasonic tool. And here you can see little rivers. Here's a little river, little bends in the river. Oh, look at this. That is classic. And that's on this well we just saw. That's what our bubbles are percolating through. We were able to actually perforate this and squeeze it and shut off that gas on this well. That's a well in Texas. Okay, we've got a few minutes and we don't even know how I interpret logs yet. So let's interpret. What do you need to succeed in bond log interpretation? How do you do it? I interpret on average about 1 log per week. I've been a little under the weather, so I've got a few logs sitting right on my desk. I'll probably wait till tomorrow to start interpreting those logs. What do you need to succeed? We now look at logs on our computer. We used to roll out the paper on the table and then argue about it. And so I want to pretend we're doing that. Here are several gentlemen. I've got other bond log tables represented by all sorts of ages and genders. This is my table of angry men. I think this is from a movie called 12 Angry Men. I've never seen it, but they're looking at a bond log here and none of them look too sure about what they're seeing. What do you need to succeed? If you want to succeed in your company, if you sit at the end of the table and wear a hat, that works for some. That may work for you. It won't take you very far in bond log interpretation, though. The hat will only go so far. I'm going to ask you, when you get before a bond log, don't try to get the answer. Try to ask the right questions that will get you to the answer. So I'm going to ask you to ask questions. Ask questions with humility. If you're not a bond log expert, don't pretend to be one. And so ask because you may not know, but ask the right questions. Also, as you ask the questions, do it with humility. We get into fights over these bond logs. And so never point your finger at anyone, ever anyway, but especially if there's a bond log around. Just take your time and ask questions. Ask them with humility, but ask them with courage. Often the answer to the bond log is given by the person, right or wrong, is given by the person with the loudest voice. I know some people who interpret or have an answer to something, but they try to collect so much data, they never get the answer out. They think a lot, but the words don't come out. And someone who doesn't know the answer says, look at the amplitude. It's bad cement. Let's squeeze. And so let's do something. Let's ask questions. And these are the 4 questions I would want you to ask. And then I'll tell you why. Just ask this. If someone's interpreting a log, I'll show up in the room. I'll have my cup of coffee. You should always interpret with a cup of coffee. It relaxes you. It's going to take a little time. We're not going to interpret in 5 minutes. But if you go into a room, before you even take your first sip of coffee, someone has already interpreted the log. Because someone has looked at the amplitude and said, good, bad. So I would want you to ask the question, hey, where was the cement supposed to be? Was there a lead and a tail? Simple question. Where was this cement supposed to be? I don't know if we see it or not, but where was it supposed to be? And suddenly the room will quiet. And they'll say, who? Well, I guess we are talking about cement. Did we have losses or flows? I know where it was supposed to be, but did we lose it or did it flow out afterwards? Could it be we just have a weak bond? You know, 80% of bond logs are affected by weak bond. Besides looking at a lot of logs, a lot of observing, another way to be an expert is just always say weak bond. You'll be right about 80% of the time. 70, 80% of the time. You'll be wrong a lot, but... And then finally, which formation is causing the problem? I heard that formations affect this log a lot. it helps us or it hurts us. So which formations? And then we interpret. Those 4 questions are beginning to build the well. They're getting us to focus on cementing. And that's what we have to do. When we interpret at ThoroughBond, we call it the 5 C's. We construct the well. We just started constructing the well by asking the questions. We compare. The bond log is relative. As we will see, this is different than this. I may not know anything about bond logs, but I can tell you this is different than this. And we compare up and down. We love to compare the free pipe where we know there is no cement to the rest of the log. We then correlate. We then consider. Oh, do we consider? The entire time we are interpreting, we are thinking, what could be going on? I know all of the things that can go on. What's going on in this well? What's the story of this well? And then we conclude. The reason I say we don't interpret logs very well, that we don't, unless we put a team together, often when we conclude, we say good or bad. When we conclude, we say, here's what happened. This is the why to the good or bad. So let's interpret a log as we'll close in the next 10, 15 minutes. Let's interpret this log. I'll remind you, for the new interpreter, straight lines are bad, crooked lines are good. High amplitude is bad. I'm not saying it's good, we just don't bank on it. Low amplitude is good. Big straight lines, bad, good. So here we interpret this log. The first thing we do is make sure we know what we're looking at. Here's our gamma ray. Our amplitude is over here. Variable density log, that's where I'm going to observe. The number 1 skill you can have as an interpreter is to have the patience to be able to relax and observe. Observation is the number 1 skill. I cannot tell you, I will take a log. I'm not sure I'm a great observer, but I know some who are, but I will take a log and I will sit in the room with it for a half hour to an hour and I'll just look at it. Drink coffee, relax. It's the best part of my days sometimes, drinking coffee and just staring at a bond log. I think it's good for your mental health too, to just stare at curved lines. We have our transit time. We have our casing collar locator. 5 curves. That's all you have to know. We construct the well bore. We want to know where the cement was supposed to be. We kind of want to know the volumes, lift pressures. We can look at the cementing chart. I'm going to warn you, sometimes you have none of this data. I look at old logs where all we know is that maybe cement was pumped. But in new wells, in what you're doing, understanding the well bore, where the top of cement is, how the job went, the more information I have, the better. Did I get returns? What were my slurries that I was pumping? What was my casing size? We construct the well bore. When we construct this well bore, we find out that this is all good tail cement, strong cement. When I say tail cement, sometimes we pump a lead that is lightweight and we finish with a tail that is strong across the productive interval. And so all of this is good cement. It's all the same casing, old 5.5-inch casing, good strong cement. I build the well bore, I start learning about my formations. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so I construct my well bore. I'm wondering, if this is all tail cement, what's going on? Something's changed and I got to figure it out. So my next step is to compare the log sections. Comparing and then correlating takes observation. We look up and down to compare. We look side to side to correlate. You've got to be patient. If you're really smart, this is tough for you because you're thinking and not just looking. You have to be a little bit brain dead to observe, but at the same time, you have to be thinking to correlate and then definitely to reason what's going on. But sometimes we want to interpret by thinking instead of observing. And the more you observe, you'll see some incredible things. I'll show you one on this log. We don't have time to observe right now because if we were, I'd say get a cup of coffee and spend 30 minutes, and we don't have that extra time. So I will not have you observe on demand, but you can see this. It's good, bad, and good. And that's all we're doing. And at those points of change, we then will correlate. And you can see it. It's very easy to see. There, it changes. What do I correlate to? I correlate back to the wellbore. What's the wellbore? Logging fluid, formation, casing, cement. And in this case, you're going to see we're either correlating to a casing joint or we're correlating to a formation. I then take a step, although it's step 4, I'm always considering the wellbore effects. This is what makes cementing and drilling people, I'm telling you, it can make some geologists and petrophysicists some really good interpreters as well, because we're thinking real wellbore. There are more than this, but we register 38 things that happen. 38 things that we have to think about when we're interpreting a log. From heavy logging fluids to barite settling colors to thermocycling, does that involve, to mud channels? Here are a couple. I'll just show you. New casing doesn't like to bond. We put a piece of new casing in this well, logged it. This is an old ultrasonic. Black is good, white is bad. It just won't log. It doesn't mean there's no cement there. It just means that bond casing to cement isn't enough to where it registers that sound wave. It reflects back into the casing. Here's another one, important one. Look at this. Straight curved lines, no straight lines, maybe a little, but beautiful job, all curved lines. If you're a starting interpreter, curved lines, you see this, it's wonderful. We pressure tested this casing to 3,000 PSI. We pulled the pressure off, and look what we did to the bond by a pressure test. Many major oil companies will either pressure test when the plug bumps and the cement is wet, where we just placed it in the annulus, or they'll run the pressure test after the bond log. So those are just 2 considerations of 38 that we're thinking about. In general, the logging engineer is not thinking about that. He's not thinking about the wellbore. He's thinking, what are these sound waves? Are they good sound waves, valid sound waves? Is my tool right? I'm thinking sound waves, and we're trying to kind of use our imagination. I call it science-based imagination is kind of the technology we do. When we see sound waves, we're thinking wellbore and what's going on. So here's our log that we need to interpret and find out what's going on here. We know it's bad, but is it just bonding or is it a channel? And so here we go. We correlate. Look where we correlate. This is the ultrasonic log on this same well. And we correlate above to 2 gammas. Once you get a correlation, it's pretty simple. You then go to this guy. I don't know if you've ever met him. Every company has one. This is our geologist. If you do not have a geologist friend, you need to get one. because the formation affects us in so many ways. The geologist is a critical position. I go to the geologist again and again to understand what's going on in the well. And I did so here as well. And what I found out, this correlation was a hot dolomite. That led me to the next step. What's that hot dolomite doing? We find out it's 200 PSI overpressured. They didn't close in an injector, and it looks like we have CO2 crossflow occurring to the other dolomite up here, which wipes out the area that we want to inject into. Now, I've not only gone from good to bad, I think I know what's happened. So we perforated here, and we circulated cement and fixed this well. Hard to do, but here's the most important thing of this interpretation. This was the first of several infill wells, and now well one, we know it was a crossflow. We know we successfully squeezed it. So we put a packer in on the next well, and look at the perfect cement job, no straight lines. We can even see a fracture here through the VDL. Well 3, we did the same thing. Here's our packer, perfect cement job. Once we know our pressure had normalized, we stopped using the packer and successfully cemented. Had we not known the mechanism, if we had just drilled the next wells, we would have experienced it again and again. Bond logs are useful. They're useful to fix the well. They're useful for better cementing. When we conclude, we only have 3 choices. Here's another easy thing. When we concluded there, it was either a strong or weak bond, a good cement job, or if it's bad, it could have been a weak bond, or we had a channel. This was cut out of a well. Or we had a channel, or we have no cement. The final conclusion in well bore construction is you either have good bond or a weak bond or a channel or no cement. That becomes your conclusions, but it's important to know why there's channeling, why there's no cement. That's part of the game. In this case, it was a cross flow. The more you observe, the more you see this cross flow occurring on this line here, right back into this fracture. CO2 cross flow disturbing the cement up here. They're very useful. Let's summarize. This is the test. Number 1 is what? You can say it out loud. Even if I can't hear you, your spouse can hear you. So you need to have your spouse learning as well. Just, you can give him or her the answer. But number 1 is the gamma. What is number 2? That is the transit time. Number 3 is the casing collar. Number 4, in a classic transition from tail cement to lead cement, just classic, as the cement intermixes, is the amplitude. And what we look at to interpret, and we've only touched the tip of a huge iceberg, is the VDL. The gamma ray, the transit time, CCL, amplitude, and variable density log. What is amplitude? What is amplitude if you were to define it for somebody? It's the height of the wave. Oops. It's the height of the wave. What is attenuation? What is resonance? Steel plus cement equals what? Can someone yell out, just so I'll know you're there? What is the #1 bond log interpretation skill? Anybody, tell me. If you get it wrong, I'll just say it's an interesting answer. So don't worry about being wrong. What is the
Observation.
#1? Okay.
Observation.
Those are not interesting answers, but those are correct answers. It is observation. As a young professional, be blank and blank. Now that I know you're there, you can answer those. What are the 2 things I'm asking you to be?
Humble and courageous.
There's nothing more beautiful than a humble, courageous person. To me, I'm not saying I'm humble and courageous, but when you see someone who is humble and courageous, we do that with bond logs by asking questions respectfully. If you're humble, you usually don't say a logging engineer can't interpret. So see, I'm not humble, but together we can interpret. And I think if you ask questions, honest questions, you'll be greatly respected, even with the professionals with a lot of experience, to learn and also to guide that we're looking for the cement. And to be an expert, you must observe, but you must what? To be an expert, you must drink coffee, observe, and
Practice.
you've got to look at them. You've got to look at them. And when you get into it's best to do that in a project setting to where it's part of something that you'll remember. It's not just going and saying, let me look at a bond log today. It means something to you. It's the story of your well. And you're going to hear a lot of opinions. You're going to see a lot of misinterpretations. Be a little skeptical in your courage and humility. Be a little skeptical, but keep looking, keep learning. And if you're guided down that path, this is a needed skill. You can be an expert. Practice every day. I want to thank you for attending the meeting. And with those good answers, I wish I'd asked a lot more questions and heard your voices, but I'd like to hear them now. If you have any questions or comments, I'll be hanging around here until Christian closes the meeting.
Thank you, Kirk. Thank you. We have a little problem with the comment section, so you're not able to make comments. So I would like persons to raise their hand or just simply unmute their microphone if they'd like to ask a question or make a comment on Kirk's presentation.
Yeah, because I can see the comments now, but it's...
Oh, okay, great.
I can
You're
now.
seeing comments, Kirk?
I think I can.
Okay.
If I actually could see, I could. But let's see if I see where people have access. I don't know if I see the questions, though. No, I do not see the questions, if there are questions.
Okay, great. So persons, if they need to, they can unmute their microphone and speak, or just raise their hand using the raise hand feature. Okay, I'm seeing one comment coming in here.
Yeah, and I can see that, but go ahead and read to me if you would, because... Is
it correct to use a specific value of amplitude to judge good or bad? I mean, a threshold. She means a threshold value for amplitude for your cement bond log.
Yes, we could have an entire session on what's called bond index. Many people use 10 millivolts. Many regulatory bodies, I meet with regulatory agencies all the time. I met with a local state, and they said, we know it's wrong to do this, but we need 10 millivolts. And I tell them, well, 10 millivolts for a tail cement, you can't make a lead cement, a weak cement, match that. You can't make these two compete against each other. And they said, I know, but we need some sort of standard. So everyone uses a threshold. I do this a lot with that threshold. You're looking at the amplitude. And so you'd have to slap yourself so many times if you use that threshold. So I disagree with that threshold very much, but many people use it. 10 millivolts, a lot of people use. I don't like it, but they do.
I have another question. I'll read it out for you, Kirk.
Yeah.
This person's name is, well, I can't pronounce the first name very well, but Gavranovic.
Yeah, I see them.
Works as a cementing specialist in National Oil Company of Serbia. He wants to know how to recognize where's the bond between tail and lead cement.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to recognize it according to what's gone in the wellbore, but obviously you can calculate volumes. You want to know about where the tail cement is, but you always have this nice gradation. We just saw it on the last slide. It goes from low amplitude to high. I'm not looking at the absolute amplitudes, but relatively speaking. And then in lead cements, the straight lines start showing up. So as soon as you start seeing straight lines, you'll usually find that area for top of cement for the tail. Again, we look at so many things on the VDL. We look at the collars. We look at the second, third, fourth arrival attenuations. We get very advanced on what the lead cement, and then we compare it to the free pipes area. But generally speaking, the difference you start seeing straight lines, higher amplitude in a sloping fashion. Yeah.
Hello, can I ask a question? Sorry, I was not able to send messages in the chat. Can you hear me first?
Yes, we can hear you. You can go ahead.
Yes.
Yes. So first, thanks very much. It was really great session. My question about the slide that you presented on the pressure test for the casing up to 3000 psi, and how the cement looks different between like before pressure test and after the pressure test. Do you mean that the pressure test is not something good and we should avoid it? Because, for example, I'm working here in Rumaila field in Iraq, and we are always doing pressure tests for the casing. So could you please expand more on this point? And I have another two questions, but we'll leave like the others to ask first.
Yes, when you pressure test, it may not happen all the time, but it happens a lot. It's been so long ago, I could probably mention a few a long time ago, but I worked in-house at Exxon in Australia. We changed all of our procedures to not pressure test because it's just breaking the bond enough to confuse the bond log. So we worked in Bass Strait, Australia, we changed. And when we didn't change, when we pressure tested accidentally before we ran the bond log, it would confuse our bond log interpretation. The same was true for Genesis project in Gulf of Mexico for Chevron. I see it all over the place. Sometimes we pressure test and it doesn't change it that much. Often it does. Therefore, often we'll pressure test when we bump the plug while the cement is wet. That way we're not stressing and de-stressing the cement. We're not breaking the bond. Or we'll run the log and then run the pressure test. Otherwise, you're going to risk being confused and thinking, which may lead to a squeeze or a misinterpretation that will cost money. I solidly recommend run that bond pressure test when you bump the plug, or wait till you run the bond log. If you want to pressure test, what you can also do is run a pressure pass. You inflate the casing and run the log under pressure, but So yes, unless your bond logs are perfect when you pressure test, then just don't worry about it. But watch that. It's very important.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Kirk, we have another question. How do you recognize the presence of a gas annulus?
Yeah, if you run an ultrasonic log, they're very sensitive to gas microannuli, so you see it easily. For the bond log, they're actually less sensitive. They're more sensitive to a liquid-filled microannulus, but less to gas. So it's hard. It can be harder to see. How do you tell the difference between a microannulus and a channel? That's what you have to differentiate. Channels usually are abbreviated. It's not one log, one 3,000 foot channel. Microannuli usually is over long distances, a very consistent pattern. So that's one way to tell. There's another thing called thin cement sheet that kind of gets in there and mixes things up. But so watch for that. It's still going, you're still going to get casing ring with the microannulus gas field. So another way is, did you do anything to cause a microannulus? Sometimes we know we did. When float equipment fails, we hold pressure on the casing, cement sets, we pull the pressure off, create a microannulus. When we change out logging fluids from a heavy to a light, again, when we pressure test. So, and there are several reasons we know we created a microannulus, and we just look at it and pick it up. If you run a pressure pass, it will tell you if you have a microannulus as well. So a lot of ways to tell. Good question.
So Kirk, we also have probably a repeat of a question earlier. Which is better to do first, the cement bond log and pressure test after that?
Yeah.
Yes. So I wanted to ask a question of my own. I'm a regulator, so you may hate me, but
I have to love you. My job is to love you.
No, so I've dealt with that whole issue of setting a line in the sand with respect to the amplitude, and I mean I would, I try to set a 0.8 bond index line in the sand, but you of course take into consideration that bond index doesn't really, it's just cement to casing and not cement to formation. And sometimes if you're dealing with a microannulus, if you're dealing with, depending upon what you're dealing with, it's more important the cement to the casing to formation bond. What do you have, like if you have a bad bond, if you have a bad job, do you have a minimum like number of feet of good cement that you need to have in order to assume isolation, or do you think a bond log can tell you anything about isolation?
Yeah, I mean, I could share some papers where, especially if you treat the perforations or the formation, it can sometimes be very difficult to get isolation nearby. There are charts that show that you need 10 millivolts for 11 feet. I mean, and all of these are very much empirical work that's been done, and it changes here and there. I just interpreted a log. We knew there was cement there. It's horrible looking. And yet we perforated about 20 feet. It looks like hardly anything's there, but it's there. You know it's there. Couldn't circulate at all. No communication whatsoever. When we're abandoning wells, we learn sometimes the millivolts we can circulate with the perf and wash tool. When we're below 5, sometimes we can't circulate when we're above 20. So it really is. Someone showed me a chart one time where it's a shotgun pattern. So it is really difficult for us outside of a subjective. Now we're working on an automatic interpretation that takes all of these into account and gives, if you will, kind of a robotic, this is how I subjectively interpret the log. That's hard to get that subjective, even if it makes good sense. even if we perforate, well, ultimately when we perforate, we'll run tracer scans and then we're okay. We're past. We actually do tracer scans to make sure there's no communication, and we get approvals for not having to squeeze or abandon a well. So I know we have to live with bond index. And I just hope the regulators, sometimes with a good argument from the oil company, would say, you're going to spend money to fix wells, but you're going to spend that money to fix the fixable wells. Those that are good, it's hard to, from a legality standpoint, but you will live and die by that 10 millivolts. We'll squeeze so many wells that we shouldn't, are unsqueezable when we use that. But I understand you have to. You have to because
I believe in methods that, so for instance, like segmented bond log tools or radial bond log tools, or the USIT, those give you a kind of 360-degree view, rather than just the bond index. But the bond index is something like to fall back on, because it's a kind of quantitative measure.
It's quantitative, and we've got a qualitative log, so that's what makes it tough. I will say this, just a final note on that. If you at least take into account, we can do algorithms that are very good documented charts created by Schlumberger and others, and we can compare lead cements, and we can be much more lenient for the lead cement. You're never going to get 10 millivolts. That 10 millivolts will equate to a 30, 40 millivolt, according to the casing size for some, and those algorithms can be shown. What's happening, I know it's happening. I witness it way too much. I can give you whatever millivolt you want. I can turn the dial if you want me to do that. If you're going by amplitude, I can make free pipe go less than 10. So that's not a game we really want to play, I don't think, So look at the VDL. As a regulator, don't always believe that 10 millivolts. If the VDL is saying I'm a lot more than 10.
Cool. Right.
Great question. I mean, we should have a really good discussion as a group about that as we advance. So appreciate the question, Christian.
All right. I'm waiting for any final questions in the group chat or by person's hands up. We're almost over our time. I believe we're basically a few minutes over our time. So I'd like to thank Kirk Harris. This was an excellent presentation, and I appreciate all the attendees. We had close to 39 attendees here today, and you can see that there's great interest in this topic, Kirk. And I was happy that I'm not happy that Miguel was not able to host today, but I was actually happy to be able to ask the questions today, because this is a topic that I like a lot, and I have a paper on it if you have an opportunity to look for my name sometime. And you can tell me whether or not everything that I said was wrong or.
I will never say it's wrong. I'll just say it's interesting. So, but send it to me. And for those of you who attended, I appreciate it. And please stay in touch. I'd love to discuss bond logs and your career, and feel free at any time to contact me.
Okay, the presentations will be shared with attendees after this session, as well as the video. So look out for that. Thank you for attending today, Kirk. Once again, a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Christian. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.